Welcome to part 5 of the Genesis story. In the first 4 parts, we've been looking specifically at the opening 3 chapters of the book. And I've tried to explain what these chapters would have meant to the people who heard them first in the context of their time and their culture and society. Now I want to stop and I want to look at the evidence from the sciences to see what that can offer to us in understanding Genesis. There are issues that we've got to address. How old is the earth and the universe? Where does evolution fit into Genesis? Does science say anything about the nature of God or the origin and nature of spirituality in humans? What about evil? How can we explain natural disasters in human suffering? And where does pain, death and immortality fit into all of this? We're going to touch upon some of these issues in this presentation, and we're going to come to some sort of conclusions in the following presentation. But I want to focus in this presentation on what science is actually saying. Now we have some problems. People come to the Bible, and indeed to the whole book of Genesis, in a spectrum of perspectives. At one end, there are those who think that the Bible are the actual words of God, without any error or mistake. Usually they use the authorized version, and they forget that the authorized version isn't the first version in the English language, and of course English is not the language in which the Bible was actually written. But that's one viewpoint. You see it more strongly in Islam, where the Quran is nearly always treated as the actual precise words of God. A copy of a book in heaven is how they see it. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, there are those who look upon the Bible as a book of stories, stories written by human beings, with purpose and meaning. We've got a wide range of views in between. Now, the line that I am taking, which I've shown in the first 4 presentations, is this. For whom was the book of Genesis written? When was it written? Who wrote it? Why did they write it? And then we can start to see, what does the text actually say? What's its meaning? What is it communicating to us? And what did it communicate at that time? So that's the approach that I have taken with regard to Genesis in this series of presentations. There are problems that we put people into neat little categories. He's an evolutionist. She's a creationist. And then there's a great tendency, you see this in many books, we caricature the views of the other group. We don't agree with them. So we set them up, then we shoot them down. That doesn't really help. Language is often used carelessly. I've used the word story with regard to Genesis. I am not implying at all that it is not true. But the author used the story form of communication because that was the way of doing it at that time, in an age when people couldn't read or write. I see language as a medium to communicate meaning. We have to use language accurately, yes. We have to go back and see what the words actually are. But what's the meaning? And on all of this, I'm suggesting we should try and avoid dogmatism. You may disagree with what I'm saying. I may disagree with your perspective. Let's not be dogmatic with each other, but accept that perhaps the other person might be right, and they've got a legitimate viewpoint which needs to be heard. This word theory. People have dismissed evolution and just said, oh, it's just a theory. Well, I'd like to see them dismissing gravity, because that's a theory too. And I certainly wouldn't dismiss it and step off the top of a 4-story block of flats onto the car park below. Scientists use the word theory in a very specialized way. It makes sense of a lot of experimental observations, and it predicts, and therefore it suggests further experiments that can be done. Let's be aware that these problems exist in the literature and try to avoid them as far as we can. The aim of this presentation is I'm going to try and bring together the evidence, particularly focusing on the sciences. What does it say? How can it help us? Because I believe that genuine inquiry can give us evidence. And the evidence from genuine inquiry from all sorts of ways will lead to some sort of consistency. And that is true. When we look at the literature and look what people have written, from every perspective, the conflicts arise because there have been wrong understandings. Let's try and come to the Bible with an open mind, but let's also try to come to the world of the sciences with an open mind. Genuine inquiry, and let's aim for consistency. Well, what is science? Well, strictly speaking, it's sciences, plural. There are a lot of them. They work in all sorts of areas of life, from out in space, to the great mathematical sciences and fractals, to geology, to the beaker in the chemical laboratory. I could go on. But the one thing about all the sciences is they get their evidence from experiments. The experiments needn't necessarily be done in a laboratory. They can be done outside in the field. They can be done at a computer terminal. But experiments. That's the characteristic nature of the sciences. And the aim is this. We're trying to explain the physical world. How does it work? We build up theories, models, understanding. We test them by experiments. And it involves communities that work together. And these communities are trained in techniques that are specialized for the research area. The key thing is evidence comes from the experimental. The results are published and the journals are refereed. In other words, you won't get a paper in unless your colleagues regard it as sound and soundly done. The findings that you get, other scientists in your field look at them. There is further testing, modification and development. For a subject to be a science, it has to fulfill that kind of pattern. These three things are so critical. But what do the sciences actually tell us? Now, different people have looked at the sciences in all sorts of ways. This was a very common perspective in the past, and it still exists. The view that science will give us all the answers, just give us time. Now, I'm quite sure that in some areas of life, that will be true. But science doesn't apply in every area of life, simply because in some areas of life, doing experiments is probably impossible. There's a postmodernist perspective, and that, if I take it to its extreme, is more or less saying that. And science might as well close its doors and shut up shop. There are some Christians who've tried to use the science to support the Bible. It doesn't work, because the Bible is not a scientific textbook. There are even more Muslims who try to use science to support the Quran, and endless websites and publications are doing this. It doesn't work either, because the Quran is not a scientific textbook. And there are quite a number of people who just look upon the sciences as a complete world of mystery that they don't understand and they don't want to understand. And you may be in that category, and don't put yourself down if you are. But come with me in this. You see, these approaches in some ways are all flawed. We've got to engage with the issues with integrity. And even if we don't understand the sciences, we can read those who do, and they can help us. Let's look at the whole issue of time. There's a lot of evidence about dating going back in the past. I'm putting up a few of them here. There are probably more, but there's a few of them that just spring to mind. We can get evidence about dating from these sources. Evidence about dating of how old the Earth is, how old the universe is. And the answers are like that. 13.7 billion years, that's 13.7 thousand million years. That's a long time. Now that figure is known pretty accurately, And the evidence from various sources gives similar figures. We're confident it's pretty close. The age of the Earth, 4.5 billion years. It's 4,500 million years, a long time. And the evidence for that is strong, consistent, and pretty precise. First life appearing on Earth, around 3.8 billion years ago. Again, the evidence is pretty good. These are not in serious doubt. The evidence is overwhelming. We must take these into account, looking at Genesis. That's strong evidence. It's confirmed evidence. Let's look at time order. Let's just plot backwards from the beginning of the Earth. 4.5 billion years ago. I'm going to take it up to 500 million years ago. That's still a long way back, 500 million years ago. A few things that happened. Earth formed then. Life, first unicellular life. Then it was multicellular life. And by about 500 million years ago, we got to sponges and algae. Life developed incredibly slowly. And our planet then wasn't what it's like today, because our planet has developed. And all this is well established, well documented, with strong evidence. There's a real problem. When we come to talk about time, the numbers are often incredibly large. Can you get your head around these numbers? Because I can't. But when we come to biology and chemistry, things are often incredibly small. And it's just as difficult to get our head around the numbers. But come with me. Live with the small and the big sizes. Let's start at 500 million years ago. That's 500 million years ago, where the last one left off. That's when animals started to appear. The dinosaurs lasted from 230 million years ago to 65 million years ago. And when the dinosaurs went, mammals came shortly afterwards. There is a connection. Much of this has been derived from the fossil records, and there's lots of fossils. The picture is remarkably consistent. There is no doubt about these dates. They're pretty good. We must take that into account in looking at the Genesis account. Now, what about ourselves? Well, human beings in the form that we understand human beings today, around 200,000 years ago in Africa. Now, if you look at the whole history of the Earth, we haven't been around very long. Let's see how we developed. Just living off the land, then a few skills to get food. Then we started to make tools. And then artistic things started to come. And then we started to think about the significance of life and death, and that's shown by humans burying their dead. Again, the evidence for this is extremely strong. How does that fit with the book of Genesis? Let's look at the next set of time. Just back 10,000 BC, just after the Ice Age. Animals domesticated, clothes being worn, communities being set up, particularly in the Middle East. Then there's the development of writing. Genesis was written. And we're coming through to the time of the life of Jesus. An awful lot of this fits beautifully with the story in Genesis. Set in Mesopotamia. The geography has been shown. 2 rivers we can identify. The style of writing of Genesis fits that era. Time order there. Just some interesting biological facts. $3 billion. That's running your body and mine. Did you know you're that number of cells in your body? That's a 1 followed by 13 zeros. 10 million cells. I warned you, the numbers would be very big. The cells are incredibly small. But inside each cell, inside every one of the 10 million cells, if you take the DNA out and stretched it out straight, because it's all folded, it would come to 2 meters. That's in every cell of your body. Isn't that incredible? And every minute, millions of cells are dividing in your body. Mutation? The only mutations that really count past the next generation are those in sex cells. 1 in a million. And that's what the present evidence suggests, that each of us, we've got 2 new genetic mutations on average in our sex cells. That can pass the next generation. The whole molecular world is absolutely tiny. All the entities are so small, unimaginably small. That blows the mind. It doesn't blow God's mind. He can handle very big numbers and very small numbers. He can handle things that are incredibly small. He made it all. Some surprising things. We don't use most of our genome, so that raises interesting questions. I suspect that more research will find ways in which we are using more of it. And we're all very similar. Now you can work back mathematically from all this gene information. We can tie it back to about 10,000 people who lived about that period of time ago. And the fossil record is consistent with that. The mathematics and the fossil record are painting the same picture. Many people say they accept microevolution but not macro. Macro means changing one species to another. But research has shown these two are essentially the same. And each of us possesses about 60 new mutations, changes in our genetic makeup, not possessed by our parents. These mutations are happening all the time, for good reasons. And when we look at all the evidence, the picture that we have a common ancestry, and it is common and linked with the other animals. Language that marks out humans, that we can communicate meaning in such sophisticated language. That's when it seems to have developed. These are amazing findings. We are living in a wonderful world, and God has made human beings to be incredibly wonderful. You may not feel wonderful. I can assure you, you are. What about evolution? 3 key words. The word species. Animals in the same species can reproduce with each other, but not with people outside that species. Now that's how the word is actually used quite precisely. Microevolution is variations that occur within a species between one animal and the next, one human and the next. Macroevolution is a development of one species from another. Now you can observe this development of one species from another within a human lifetime. It happens in the wild. So the idea that we have no experimental evidence of evolution is just not true. And the mechanisms for this, at least some of them, are known. Probably there's a lot more still to be found, but that's research for the future. The key phrase is natural selection. Now that's the quotation of a very eminent biologist, who is also a totally committed follower of Jesus. He talks about genetic variations. Now most of these don't bring a benefit or a disbenefit, but they happen naturally within all of us and within all animals, all plants, all the time. And it's a rigorous filter. It reduces genetic variation. But sometimes a variation can bring a benefit. Now the benefit will be important if the animal concerned either lives longer or fathers or mothers more offspring, because that benefit is passed on. And over the generations, these beneficial variations will be preserved and multiplied because they are giving a benefit to produce more offspring. Keeping that in mind, the genes mutate, and there's loads of mechanisms that cause these mutations. Indeed, I would go as far to say that life as we know it would not be possible. Life could not survive on this planet without genes mutating. We need that flexibility. As genes mutate, some individuals have slight benefits. They can be passed on, and the populations derived from them have changed, and they are the ones who have the benefit. They grow faster. The thing is this, that genes mutate, and the reasons are well known, at least some of them. Some confer advantages, but populations evolve. Individuals don't evolve. A fish can't say, I'd like some legs to walk on the land, and legs grow and they walk out. That's just rubbish. Populations evolve because individuals have gained an advantage by a gene mutation. And it happens over enormous periods of time, which we can't imagine. Reproduction is central to this. Why is it so wasteful? Think of human beings. In one sexual encounter, the average male will release 250 million sperm. Only the best make it to the female egg. This is a wonderful story. It's a remarkable way to make sure that only the best get through. Natural selection is operating here very strongly, so that the offspring will be the best that possibly could be. What a wonderful world we live in. And God has made it wonderful. And without this, human life would never have developed. You look at the brain, it's a similar kind of pattern. We're born with all sorts of neurons, the brain cells. 10 to the power 11 of them. That's a 1 followed by 11 zeros. That's a lot of brain cells. But more die off in the developing brain than those that survive to adulthood. And not all the connections are developed. Again, it's an evolutionary process, it's a natural selection to make sure the best are there. God only wants the best for life, and God only wants the best for you and me. What a wonderful way to do it. The variations and the mutations in our genes produce this genetic diversity, and it may affect reproductive success, and that may generate a natural selection and an improved population, a different population, and eventually even a new species. And if you look at the genes we humans possess, you can track backwards into the past, and it reveals a fantastic history of the human genome. But that's another story. And there are people who've done this, and simply in doing this, have been stunned and amazed, and have realized there's an almighty God behind this. Now, there are objections to evolution. Let's look at a few of them. There are those who say that people don't all agree that there is evolution. Well, in fact, that's not true. there is no disagreement in the biological world. There's still a lot of research to be done and a lot of controversy about a lot of the mechanisms, but there's no disagreement about evolution. People argue that any evidence against evolution is being suppressed by biologists. That's complete nonsense. That's not the way science ever works. Science loves controversies. It never suppresses things that way. They also say that chance contradicts the idea of purposefulness in God. They misunderstand the word chance. What's chance to us isn't chance to God. They say evolution is not based on repeatable experiments. Again, that's not true. There's evidence from the experimental world. And the second law of thermodynamics, this law determines the direction of change. It doesn't contradict it. They misunderstand the second law of thermodynamics, and I've read it in their books. It's an area I know a little bit about. They're not taking into account everything in the entire system. There are those who say, well, God has planted all the fossils there, but that's to test our faith to see if we really hang on to the Bible. Well, they're not understanding faith, but it's kind of making God a trickster. There are those who say things are too complex. There's no way that could have evolved. Well, more and more research is showing the mechanisms by which it has evolved. Those who say that if it were true, it would be in the Bible. Now stop for a minute. Nobody at the time the Genesis was written could have made any sense of it. The whole concept of evolution in its modern sense only arose in the 19th century. And special acts of creation explain it all. In fact, they generate a lot of problems and they contradict the evidence, and they also contradict things actually within the Bible elsewhere. Come back to that in a moment. There's a kind of gradation of perspectives. I spoke about those who looked upon the Bible, and in Genesis particularly, just simply a story. That's at one end. There are those who think they can have collation of stories, but there's something behind the stories. Others who see a couple, a kind of progenitors of God's new people on earth. Some see God intervening in a long process of evolution to produce two humans. These people have been labelled old earth creationists. They accept the age of the earth and the universe, but evolution wasn't good enough. God intervened with special creations. And there are those who take the Bible and say it's a literal 6-day creation, 6 24 hours, and the planet's about 10,000 years old. They are usually referred to as young earth creationists. You may have heard of those who have followed this idea of intelligent design. It's not quite the same as old earth creationists, but perhaps it fits somewhere in this perspective, in that position along the line. There's all sorts of perspectives and views. Now I want to look at these, and I'm going to look at them critically. Don't get upset by this. In looking at them critically, I'm basing my comments on evidence. And if you come to a different view, that's fine, but you must have the evidence to back yourself up. A story just with purposes of teaching eternal truths made up. Some point in history humans began to know about God. They disobeyed God. This picture is totally consistent with all that comes from the sciences. It doesn't explain the spiritual nature of God, and it accepts it doesn't explain that, and accepts that as a divine intervention. What worries me about this is there's too much of the book of Genesis that seems to read like real history. There's something more than just a made-up story. So I have a slight hesitation about this perspective. Let's look at the second one. This has the idea that somewhere over the 2,000 years of human existence, humans became aware of God and consciously rejected God. And Genesis is a kind of retelling of these episodes, which repeated all over the place, put them in a Middle Eastern culture, but it's kind of separated the Middle East from all over the place. Fits the whole scientific evidence? Again, it accepts that there has to be some explanation of man's spiritual nature. My problem with this one is it's lost the Middle Eastern sense of reality. But it does capture a lot of other reality. Let's look at the third one. God called mankind to look after the world. And a man, either specific or general, is viewed as a kind of federal head of all humanity. Something happened over that period of time, somewhere in the Middle East and Mesopotamia. It all fits. Usually, people who hold this kind of view see Adam and Eve as real people, though some see them as sort of kind of typical real people. And there was a rebellion. And therefore, all the people descended from this real couple are contaminated with the rebellion. It fits the evidence from the sciences. Again, it accepts that you need some sort of special intervention from God in bringing the spiritual nature to man. That seems to go beyond scientific evolution. Now, it's a story of real people, and it does fit the evidence. That one is worth looking at as well. The fourth one, I've labelled this one, because people usually describe themselves this way. It accepts the earth is very old, but it sees God intervening miraculously at various points, particularly in the creation of mankind. So Adam and Eve were created directly. They're not a result of any evolutionary process, but that contradicts the scientific evidence. They were created without sin. Plants and animals physically died before the fall, but humans didn't. They weren't there. It contradicts the evidence from a lot of areas of biology and the fossil record of paleontology. It also raises problems with the biblical text in other places. Come back to that in a moment. You see, it contradicts too much evidence, both biblically and scientifically. So I hesitate about that one. Now let's look at the fifth one. A literalistic view. It separates man's genetic makeup completely from the animals, and that contradicts all the scientific evidence. It runs counter to all the scientific evidence in almost everything. And it does raise the possibility that God had planted all the fossils in the rocks, and he's a kind of deceiver. The laws of science only start to work after Adam and Eve had disobeyed. No evidence of that at all. And death now comes into the world, a general state of decay. Well, there is a general state of decay in the world. It's completely inconsistent with the evidence from all of biology and the fossil record, and given the overwhelming clear-cut nature of that evidence, that raises real problems. It also raises real problems with the biblical text like the previous model. Let me give you one example of that. If we look at the Bible this kind of a way, we've got to look at the rest of the Bible the same way. That means we've got to believe in the earth being flat, built on pillars which come out of water, covered over by a dome into which are studded stars and across which the sun and the moon move. That was the picture in biblical days. They had no other picture. Now, if we're going to treat the Bible that way, we've got to accept that, and I suspect there's not too many of us would. This one contradicts almost all the evidence that we can possibly find. And yet there are many people who still hang on to it. There are 5 models. It depends how we see the Bible. It depends how we look at evidence from the sciences, and depends whether we've learned any lessons from history. For example, do we see the Bible as dictated by the Holy Spirit, inspired by the Holy Spirit, or just a human text full of insight? Now, in the Christian world today, the middle one is the one which is most widely held, for very sound reasons. Science has got overwhelming agreement on the main findings. Okay, some of the mechanisms need a lot more research. Are we just going to dismiss that and regard all science as just nonsense, that is a serious step to take. What about history? Now just go back in history. Galileo challenged the church of his day. The church of his day thought that the earth was the centre of the universe. Galileo, through his research by experiments, found that in our solar system the sun was the centre, not the earth. He was nearly thrown out of the church and thrown into prison simply because of this. Do we want to have that kind of thing repeating itself? We've lessons to learn. It's interesting, this. Darwin never used the word evolution. Now, people often make that Darwin lost much of his own faith. That's true, although he's buried in Westminster Abbey. But he made it absolutely clear he had no anti-religious agenda. He was actually trained to be a clergyman. And the reason he lost his faith was the tragic death of his young daughter. In his day, his ideas were welcomed, and his ideas were accepted. But his ideas have been abused. That doesn't make them wrong, but they have been abused in a terrible way, in all sorts of ways. Darwinism, or the origin of species, evolution, natural selection, that applies to the biological world. You can't lift it out and apply it to anything else. Bit of history. If we look back in history, the traditional way of viewing Genesis in the Jewish era and in the early Christian era, fair amount of the Christian era, was as a set of stories. Again, stories not suggesting they're not true. Stories because that was a way of communicating, the same as when Jesus was alive, he communicated by parables. Deep spiritual meaning. For 1,000 years, the Bible was lost to ordinary folk because they couldn't read or understand Latin, and the church of the day wouldn't allow it to be translated into any other language. The Reformation saw the restoration of the authority of the Bible, and the Roman Catholic Church responded. And they said this, that the Bible was written at the dictation of the Holy Spirit. They wanted to go one further than the Reformers. And in fact, they only retracted that in Vatican II in the mid-20th century, when they said it was written at the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, which would be widely agreed by most followers of Jesus today. The first major translation into English was the Geneva Bible of 1560. 75% of the authorised version is a straight copy of the Geneva Bible, translated by William Tyndale. Had a huge impact. And the literalistic view of Genesis only started to become into thinking in the 16th century, when the Bible became available and people could see it no other way. But it was not strong. But it was revived in the 20th century, publication of a book about 1960. Intelligent Design started in 1991, first major publication then. And it arose because, from many other reasons, and it is not just one thing, that this creationism, this literalist approach, it faced too many problems to be comfortable. That's a bit of the history. The key findings from research: there's overwhelming evidence about timescales. Overwhelming evidence related to evolution. Ways of looking at Genesis: the literalistic approaches, they generate a lot of problems. Now we've got to be honest and face them. And it's a particular way of looking at the Bible that generates the controversies. And in some ways we are at fault, not the scientists. I am looking for harmony. And I have observed that many scientists who are committed followers of Jesus, they don't see the problem. Can we learn from what they're saying, what they're telling us? I believe we can. In the next presentation, I'm going to continue this by trying to bring the world of science more closely to the world of Genesis.